think we still need to wait for a bit, maybe 2 more minutes more, and I'll let Laila to start the thing. I'm sure that people will be trickling up, trickling in after this. So Laila, let's wait for another 2 minutes before you start. So we'll start at 56 something or other. You're going to introduce things, and then I'm going to introduce Mo, and we should be able to start at just about Bali time 9 o'clock on the hour.
All right. So I think I'm gonna start now. I'm going to start using Indonesia in English because I think the participants from Indonesia as well as from international. So, selamat pagi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Selamat datang. Perkenalkan, saya Laila Sari Andika. Terima kasih telah mengikuti acara webinar Large Whale Necropsy Case Studies. Ini adalah lanjutan dari pelatihan penanganan kejadian mamalia laut terdampar bagi dokter hewan. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laila Sari Andika. Thank you for joining the webinar of Large Whale Necropsy Case Studies. This is the continuation of training for handling standard marine mammals events for veterinarians that is held yesterday. All right, so before we start and while waiting for others, please find the attendance link that we have provided in chat room. Sebelum kami mulai, dipersilakan kepada Bapak Ibu dan peserta sekalian untuk mengisi daftar hadir yang telah kami sediakan di chat room. All right, the webinar will be led by Mbak Ica or Putuliza Mustika. Mbak Ica?
Okay.
Mbak Ica is, Mbak Ica is one of our experts in marine wildlife. Mbak Ica, please, you can start.
All right, thank you, Laila. Hi, everyone. So we are now live on YouTube as well, and I think there will be some more people coming in. But just I think we would like to start right on the dot. So perhaps what I will do first is just to share. Mo is actually from the California Academy of Sciences. She's the Ornithology and Mammalogy Collection Manager. Maybe I should also switch to Indonesian as well, because jadi Maureen Flannery panggilannya Mo itu dari California Academy of Science di Amerika Serikat, dan posisi beliau adalah manajer koleksi untuk ornithology dan mammalogy, jadi untuk burung dan mammal. Beliau juga sering sekali terlibat, secara rutin sekali terlibat dalam penanganan kejadian terdampar mamalia laut di California, dan juga termasuk yang paus besar. Nah, kenapa kami mengundang Maureen itu karena memang karena Maureen dan timnya memang sering sekali melakukan nekropsi paus besar, dan paus besar di Indonesia itu masih jarang untuk dinekropsi gitu. Makanya kami melakukan ini. So the reason why we're inviting Mo is because of your expertise, Mo, in dissecting the large whales, the large cetaceans, and we have not actually done quite a lot of that in Indonesia. Just as like a brief introduction to the Indonesian stranding network, if you will, we started the stranding network in 2003. We started to make the database already in 2004, but we made it online just in January 2013. Sorry, not 2003, 2013. So it was 2013 that we actually put the database online, the whalestrandingindonesia.com. And then on the same year, we were trained by some people in the Philippines with the Ocean Adventure, then Ocean Park Hong Kong, and many other distinguished speakers from the Asian Circle. At least Southeast Asian Circle, we were trained how to do first responding there and also necropsy, but mostly it's actually on the small cetaceans because understandably it's easier to do necropsy on the small cetaceans. And in the same year, 2013, we started to establish our national stranding network for the marine mammals. And then we started to make the regional stranding networks like in Bali, in around Jakarta Bay, etc., and also in East Nusa Tenggara. So we have done quite a lot of stranding response training for the first responders in Indonesia, but we have done very little training, very few trainings for the vets. And so today's event is actually part of the vet training. We are doing it online because of the situation, but this is part of the vet training, and we are so honored that you are willing to share your stories with us. Ya, jadi hari ini sebetulnya kami melakukan training vet bersamaan dengan speakingnya Maureen ini. Kemarin kami sudah melakukan training vet, dan hari ini juga training vet lagi, tapi yang untuk sesi ini kami buka untuk umum begitu. Okay, it's already bang on the clock, so the floor is yours, the screen is yours, Maureen.
Great, thank you very much for, thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
Great. Here we go. Well, if you've done a necropsy on a small cetacean, you will have no problem doing one on a large cetacean. It's just a much bigger project than a small one, and you probably can't do it by yourself or with only one or two people. So we're going to chat about that today. But I started my career as an ornithologist studying birds. And then in 2008, when our main field responder, who always worked on necropsies and things, broke his leg, I had to start doing whale necropsies for our team. And so I really learned on the job, on the beach, on the whale. And that is the best way to learn and to figure these things out. All right. Oops. And my slides are not moving. There we go. So just a little bit about our collection first, so you know where I'm coming from. Here at the California Academy of Sciences, we have over 140,000 specimens in the birds and mammals collection. 100,000 of those are birds, and about 32,000 are mammals, and 11,000 are eggs and nests. They range in size from this tiny hummingbird egg to an 87-foot blue whale skeleton from 1908 that hangs in our main exhibit hall. And I'm responsible for the care of all of these specimens. And the collections are used by a variety of people from all over the world. They're available to researchers to study, to look at the morphology of the animals, where the animals come from, individual variation in species, and a lot of researchers use them to identify bones from archaeological sites. There are also references for future work. So if someone in the future wants to look at climate change, or now, we can look at climate change, and we can look at different specimens from the past and see how things have changed. They can look at environmental contaminants. Specimens are used in all sorts of technologies that did not exist 100 years ago, like genetics, stable isotopes, CT scans, and who knows what people are going to come up with in the future. So that is why we do archive specimens in the collection. We have over 6,500 marine mammal specimens, not the largest marine mammal specimen in the world, but one of the largest. We do have the world's largest collection of California sea lions, with over 3,000 California sea lions. They're kind of our specialty. We have the largest collection of southern sea otters, which are the sea otter that's only found here in California. And we have the North America's largest collection of Guadalupe fur seals. We have 49 species represented in the collection, lots of skulls, skeletons, baleen, teeth if the animal had teeth, and a frozen tissue collection as well. Over the years, more than 185 researchers have utilized the specimens to produce more than 70 scientific publications. So when we go out on a large whale, we do collect some parts of it. We don't always collect the whole thing. We rarely ever collect very big bones because we don't have enough space. But there are some smaller specimens that are valuable for research that are easy to get, or easier to get, off of the beach. So we will collect bones like the pelvic bone. Here you can see Ray Bandar, our former volunteer, holding a blue whale pelvic bone. Now, Ray always claimed the pelvic bone was the hardest bone to find in a whale's body, but the easiest bone to take off the beach. Well, maybe around 2011 or so, I decided that I was not going to let these pelvic bones get the better of me. And so every time I worked on a whale, I very carefully outlined and drew where I found the pelvic bone. And now my team can find a pelvic bone within like the first 15 minutes of a necropsy, maybe a half an hour, because if the blubber is really thick. But we know where to go on males and where to go on females, and we can find them pretty easily. So I no longer say it's the hardest bone in the animal to find. I actually think it's one of the easiest, and it's definitely easy to get off the beach. Baleen is very important to preserve. Baleen can give you a story of the whale's life for the certain period of time that that baleen has been growing, which in some species is 3 years, some species it's more than that. But basically baleen is keratin. And so if people sample baleen, I'm going to point on the screen. You can sample different sections of this piece of baleen here, the baleen plate, and look at stable isotopes, look at contaminants, look at hormones. It can tell you when a whale, if it was female, was pregnant, where they were feeding in the ocean based on the stable isotopes. You can get a nice picture of the recent life of that whale. Teeth. We have sperm whale teeth that we collect. Sperm whale teeth can also be cut in half, sectioned in half, and then you can actually count the layers of cementum and dentin inside the tooth, and that tells you how old the animal is, just like counting the layers of a tree. And you can use a very fine drill and drill out the layers and look at the stable isotopes so you know where the animal was feeding in the ocean when it grew that layer, that specific layer. Tissues, we always archive muscle tissue for genetics, skin tissue also for genetics. We collect blubber for contaminant studies. There's actually a researcher who's looking at microplastics in blubber right now. And blubber can be used to look at lipids and other questions too. Earplugs. Earplugs are kind of an amazing part of the whale, and they actually are one of the hardest parts of the whale to find because of where they are situated inside the skull. You have to have the whale in the correct position, and you have to really dig down in to get to it. I found my first earplug just this summer in June. I have looked and looked and looked, and I've never found one. And then this one whale was in the perfect position, and I actually found it. And it's very cool because the earplug, which is this picture in the upper right-hand corner here, that's an earplug from a gray whale. And again, just like the baleen, you can take sections of the earplug and you can age the animal. You can look at hormone levels, you can look at contaminant levels, and you can learn a lot about the whale. And this is a record of the whale's entire life because the ear wax gets laid down throughout its entire life because it does not come out. So if you can find an earplug, it's an amazing piece of information. But good luck. Now that I've found one, I'm hoping I can find more. Skin samples I already talked about, and then parasites. We do often collect barnacles and cyanids that are on the external body of the carcasses and archive those. You can look at the barnacles and take sections of the barnacles, and that will tell you where the whale was living when those barnacles grew. So they also tell the history story of the whale. And then internal parasites from the intestinal tract, if there are any lung parasites, we do collect those as well. So some marine mammals are protected, as you know, some are endangered species. We do all of our work through special authorization from the National Marine Fisheries Service here in the United States, and through an ESA permit through the National Marine Fisheries Service. And most of our whale necropsy we do with the Marine Mammal Center. We make a great team. Not every group has the ability to form a big team like this, but our two organizations work together very well, and we have for many, many years, which makes working on something like this 80+ foot, I think it was 82 foot female blue whale, a much easier task if you have a whole team of people from two different organizations. And so we have our specialties when we're working on a stranding. So I am not a veterinarian, but the Marine Mammal Center does have a pathologist on staff who comes to the whale necropsies whenever he can. There's also, they have a necropsy manager. She leads their side of the team. I lead our side of the team. And they have vet technicians, vet interns, vet externs, and volunteers that join the team. We have a team of about 6 to 8 volunteers from our team and staff that join the Marine Mammal Center to work on the necropsies. So once we're working on a whale, because Cal Academy is a museum and we think about bones a lot, we kind of focus on the bones and the skeleton and the muscles of the carcass. And so we're looking for that pelvic bone. We're opening up the dorsal side and looking for hemorrhaging and looking for broken vertebrae. We're looking for broken ribs. Of course, they're looking for bones too when they are looking for breaks, when they do find bones as well. But mostly the Marine Mammal Center folks are going in for the tissues. You know, they're looking at the intestines, they're looking at the reproductive tract, they're recording what's in the stomach, they're looking at the lungs and the heart and taking samples of all of the organs for histo. So we make a really wonderful team, all of us working together, and we could not do it without each other. We couldn't do a thorough job without the other team. We also collaborate with the Marine Mammal Center on small cetacean CT scans, and then we archive some special specimens from their rehabilitation center. If they don't make it, they're part of the cancer study. There's some unusual species, or there's species that show signs of human interaction. Then we archive those skulls in particular in our collection at the Academy. So it's a great collaboration. So whenever there's a whale on the beach, we really want to try and do a necropsy, because really the only way to determine what happened to that whale is to open it up and to look for the evidence. There's very little external signs of what happened. Sometimes there are, but in most cases, you cannot tell from looking at the outside of the whale what happened to it. And even if a whale comes in on a ship, which I know you all had recently in your area, just by the pure fact that it's on the front of the ship, well, we all know that it probably was hit by the ship, but the ship might say, well, no, it was just floating dead, and then it got stuck on the front of our ship. So unless you open that carcass up to see what it looks like inside, you can't really say whether the whale was alive when the ship hit it or not. But there are ways to do that when you open it up, and I'll talk to you about those. So basically, we're looking to see if there's a human interaction cause of death. So that could be ship strikes, it could be fisheries related, bycatch, that's mostly for smaller cetaceans that are caught in nets, gear ingestion, if an animal eats a bunch of ghost fishing gear, you can often find it inside their GI tract. and entanglements. And entanglements, sometimes the entanglement is there and sometimes you're just looking at scars. And then we're also looking for any signs of disease, which of course are more likely to show up on histology than they are to show up during the gross necropsy. So this is a juvenile female humpback whale that we just worked on in early September. And she actually stranded alive, which we rarely ever get live strandings here, thank goodness. The shape of the coastline here makes it so that live animals don't end up on the beach very often. This is only the third live cetacean that I've had to deal with, and only the second one, large whale. And so she was in the surf, alive, got herself back out into the water, but then died in the water. So we got the necropsy team together and we were out within 40 hours of when the carcass, when she was alive on the beach. So it had not been there for very long. And already the liver and the kidneys were too autolyzed to be able to make any definite determine the cause of death. There were no obvious signs of injury in the parts that we could see. There was one hemorrhaging section, but it was not associated with any broken bones and it was very focal. So unfortunately, sometimes you don't get an answer, and it's a shame when the animal is alive and very fresh and you still can't get an answer. We're still waiting on some cultures and histology. So hopefully we'll get an answer, but right now we don't have one. But you can see in this photo that we have started to flens back the blubber. That's the first step. And before we even do that, there are a couple of things that we have to do on every whale prior to putting a knife into the carcass. And because we cannot get heavy machinery onto the beaches here, all of our work is manual labor with knives and gaff hooks. We do not have, very rarely do we have the opportunity to use a bulldozer or anything like that. On the East Coast, they have a lot more opportunity. East Coast US, they have a lot more opportunity to use heavy machinery. So we can only see the part of the whale that is available to us because we can't move it. So before we cut into anything, we take 1 million morphometric measurements, not 1 million, but there are a lot, total length, snout to anus, snout to eye, snout to ear, ear to eye, anus to genital slit, all sorts of measurements. And so we have to get those measurements on every carcass. And then we also take a series of photographs of the carcass prior to the necropsy. So this is just one shot that gets one view. So this is the ventral view of this male gray whale. But then we would go on the other side and get the dorsal view the best we can. We go around the carcass, taking photos of each section of the carcass closer up. And that's primarily because we may miss something during the necropsy that we want to go back and look at later. And so we have the photo documentation to go back and look. And you always want some nice full body shots so that people can see the entire carcass. And then I'm going to start talking about some case studies. So I thought I would start with this one because it did come in on the bow of a ship into San Francisco Bay. And that picture just reminded me of the picture that Icha shared with me of the whale coming in on that bulbous bow of the ship. So this one ended up in San Francisco Bay. Typically, when the boat turns to go into the bay, the carcass will fall off, and then it's floating in the bay, and then it becomes a vessel hazard. And so the Army Corps of Engineers here in California will then tow the whale to a different location to get it out of the way of ships and small vessels. And we have the luxury of a great agreement with a state park. Angel Island State Park has a beach. We call it Whalebone Beach. They call it like Stinky Beach or something like that. But typically Army Corps of Engineers will tow the carcass to the beach, and then we have to take a boat to get to the beach to perform the necropsy. So it's only accessible by boat, which is good because one of the aspects of a necropsy that I'm not going to talk about today, but is very important, is the public outreach side of things. If you're on a very busy beach in a very populated area, you want to cordon it off, bring some tape or some sticks and some rope and cordon off the area and try and keep the public away from the carcass. When you're working with knives and it's slippery and you just don't want people coming in and getting hurt. And also you have a certain, here we only have a certain amount of time because of the tides. So we can't be stopping and starting and answering all sorts of questions. So if it's a super busy beach, I will actually bring some docents, some volunteers to talk to the public, and they'll interact with the public, and I'll give them updates throughout the necropsy, and then they can share the information. But here on Angel Island, we have the luxury of never having any public to deal with because no one can get there unless they're in a kayak or something. So here's the carcass on the beach after it was towed. And I'm just going to go through the steps of what we're looking for in a case of a ship strike. And so here on this side, these on the left side, these are the photographs that we took prior to cutting the animal open. And you can see there were some external injuries that we wanted to document. So this top one was an injury that was determined to not be new, but was a healed scar, potentially from a rope at some point, but it was not, it was determined not to be fresh. And then what this bottom photo shows is some rust and some bruising under the skin. And that was where we assumed the carcass was laying over the bow of the ship. So this rusty part of the body was in contact with the ship. But we couldn't see the whole thing because the dorsal side was under here. So then when we open up the blubber, when we strip the blubber down so that we can see the carcass, we can get a good image of it. We're looking for signs of hemorrhaging. So here's the carcass with the blubber strips taken down. And you can see that here along the base and in the strips themselves, there's some sign of hemorrhaging. Now, when the animal's laying on its back like that, you can't always be sure that it's not lividity, where the blood sinks when the carcass is in the same position for a period of time after it has died. But we do note the hemorrhage, the sign of hemorrhage here. And then there was some more specific hemorrhaging. You can see here the muscle is hemorrhaged, and then there's also some hemorrhage into the blubber layer. Once you get into the muscles, I guess this is that injury. I'm noticing now someone pulling out the insides of that injury. But what we often will find, if there's been hemorrhaging and if there's been an injury, there is extensive macerated muscle. In some cases, it's completely liquefied. And so you'll have areas where there's nice muscle right next to areas where the muscle just is friable and falls apart as you touch it, or is just hanging there in threads like that. And so this is macerated muscle at the site of the injury. So once you found the hemorrhage, then you find the macerated muscle, then you really want to dig into the vertebrae because you never know what you're going to find in there. And with this carcass, once we got into the vertebrae, we noticed, and this is the bottom right photo, the vertebrae were actually dislocated at a 90-degree angle. So there was a major injury that's probably severed the spinal cord and dislocated the vertebrae. So we have that photographed, and then there were lots of pieces of broken bones and broken processes from those vertebrae. So with all of that evidence, you have the hemorrhage, which shows that the animal was alive when it was suffered the blunt force trauma. That's mostly this hemorrhage down here. You have the macerated muscle, which is the injured muscle degrading much faster than other muscle. And then you have the broken bones. So in this case, we would say the animal had blunt force trauma consistent with a ship strike. So we never say a definite ship strike. Some people have said that, but we try not to say that. You can say probable, possible. There are different definitions for those different assessments. But I like to say blunt force, showed signs of blunt force trauma consistent with a ship strike. And of course, people always say, well, what else would cause that kind of blunt force trauma? Oops, someone is not muted.
Sorry. Guys, could you, Bapak Ibu, tolong di mute ya, sebentar. Hold on, I'll find somebody who's not muted. Okay.
Sudah, Mbak, sudah.
Udah, okay, yeah. All right, sorry, Mo.
That's okay, no problem. So you want all of these keys to fit together in order to be able to say what you think the cause of death is. So here's another whale. This is another 80-foot blue whale. This was my first blue whale. She washed up on a beach with lots of rocks. And so her intestines came out of her mouth and ended up all over the beach. And also her fetus, which was about 3/4 of the way through gestation, ended up on the beach. So we were able to actually collect specimens, bone samples, ribs, and things from the fetus. The fetus was 17 feet long, and they're typically born around 20 to 23 feet. So this one was a little bit harder because she's on her back, but let's look and see what it looked like inside. So this is a great example of what you're looking for when you're looking for hemorrhaging. And so on the picture on the left, you can see some healthy muscle here on the left side of the body, and here too. And then you can see all this dark hemorrhaging to the right. And it's really obvious here where the field person is working. You can see the nice muscle, healthy muscle here, and then all this macerated hemorrhaging muscle here. And this gives you a good idea of some of the gear that we use. There's a knife. We use these long veterinary gloves that I think are used for inseminating cows or something. And then we wear rain slickers mostly, although waders are also a good idea, especially if you're climbing into the whale itself, because if you are wearing boots and slickers and you bend down, sometimes the water, the blood, everything can get inside your boots. So waders are nice to wear if you're in a safe place that you can wear waders. But this is what you're looking for when you're looking for hemorrhaging. And so for this animal, we dug deeper in and we did find broken bones as well. So again, blunt force trauma consistent with ship strike. Here's a humpback whale. Here we're taking the measurements in the beginning of the necropsy. So really important to get all those measurements in. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like when you find broken bones. So here you can see me, I'm moving they're broken pieces of the lateral processes of the vertebrae. So we found 3 or 4 that were broken, and that last one was secure. So it takes a lot of digging to get in there. And then you really have to clear the muscle around the vertebrae to really make sure that they are solid or not solid. And sometimes you'll find them and sometimes you won't. But this is another piece of evidence that there's broken bones from trauma. So sometimes you have an animal on the beach that has trauma, signs of trauma, but there's no broken bones. Like in this case, you know, part of the face is damaged, and there were bruises along the body. We did not see any signs that this was an orca attack. But I'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes you have signs of trauma and you don't have any broken bones, and so you can't really say what exactly the cause was. So just a little bit of hemorrhaging, like in the live whale that died just early September. We found a small amount of hemorrhaging, no broken bones. It was very focal. We couldn't come up with an answer for that. And sometimes you just can't. But there are, around here, we do have some intraspecies aggressions that happen with whale carcasses. So this is a gray whale calf, a juvenile, actually, not a calf. It was 27 feet, 850 centimeters. And even though it has very little skin, you can see the black skin has pretty much sloughed off most of the carcass. You can still see in the inner layers these rake marks. So those marks are indicative of orca teeth biting at the carcass. And then one telltale sign of an orca predation is missing tongue and missing lower jaws. That's the part of the animal that they feed on first, and often you're left with the most of the carcass, and the tongue and the jaws are gone. We always wondered why that was the case. Everybody always asks, why do they only eat the tongue and why don't they eat the whole thing? And someone probably asked that, and I'll answer that now. I actually learned from some orca researchers in Alaska just recently that what orcas do in Alaska is when they capture, say, a young gray whale, they will eat what they can when they first capture it, and then they kind of store it in a refrigerator, not a real refrigerator, but a bay or some protected area where the carcass can just stay in that area. It's not going to float out. And they go back and feed on it. So it's kind of like you and I. If we sit down to dinner, we don't eat half of the cow or half of the pig or half of the chicken. We eat a small portion, whatever we can fit. And then we come back for leftovers the next day. Well, that's what the orcas are doing. They're getting their fill from the tongue and the mandibles when they kill the animal, but they don't have a way of storing it in the refrigerator here in the San Francisco Bay Area because there are no protected inlets where they can store the carcass. And so then the carcass just washes up on the beach, and we find it and we do a necropsy. So that's one really cool thing that I just learned in the last year. And it helps explain the entire why the tongues are missing. So this summer we had two interesting orca predation cases. We had on June 11th, this whale in the upper right-hand corner was reported floating about 7 kilometers offshore of north of San Francisco. And the intestines are coming out. There's some major injuries on this floating carcass. And we typically do not see injuries like that on floating carcasses. If a carcass is floating out at sea before it comes to shore and someone sees it, typically it looks like something with a big, huge balloon. So the tongue will fill up with gas as the body starts to decompose, and it makes this huge balloon. And that's what takes the carcass with the winds towards the shore. So typically we get these pictures of a big balloon with a carcass underneath it floating about the same distance. But in this case, the carcass was all messed up and ripped up. And immediately we thought, oh no, it got, cut by a propeller or something on a big ship. Well, at the same time, we got another report just south of San Francisco. So not that far, maybe about 27 miles. I'm not sure how many kilometers that is from the first sighting. There was another carcass floating with its intestines all out, hanging out, and some obvious bodily injuries. And we kind of freaked out and we're thinking, oh my God, there's some ship out there that's purposefully hurting these animals. But we had no way to do anything about it or to go investigate because they were just floating. So 4 days after the initial observations, there was a group of people who were out doing some surveys along the coast, looking for marine mammals and seabirds and testing the water and doing krill surveys. And they happened to come across the first carcass that had been floating. And they got really close to it and they were able to take tons of photographs, which we were so lucky to get because this carcass never came up on shore. And so you can see, here's the flipper. So based on the flipper, we were able to identify it as either a fin whale or a sei whale. Sei whales do not come here very often, so it probably is 𝗿𝗏𝗿𝗆𝗿𝗆𝗿𝗏, a fin whale. But we don't know for sure. And so we called it either a fin or a sei. But the flipper shape at least got us into the right family. But then you can see all over this flipper are orca rake marks. And it's not surprising. This was a juvenile carcass. It was not huge. It was like maybe 1,000 centimeters or so. And the team also reported that the tongue was missing and the mandibles were also missing. And so that evidence, even though we didn't see it with our own eyes, that was enough evidence for us to determine that this was an orca predation. And orcas had been seen in the area around the time of the first reported floating carcass. The other carcass, the one that was more fresh, it did eventually wash up on shore, but by the time it washed up on shore, it was so badly decomposed, we couldn't see much of anything. There were no flippers left, so we couldn't look for orca rake marks. And it was mostly just like what you end up left with is kind of a whale shroud. It's like the skin that just turns into this floating blanket, and they stick around for a really long time. So some bones and a whale shroud and some baleen. And the baleen was black and white, so we were able to identify it as a fin whale, but we could not find any cause of death. But based on the injuries, the intestines coming out, because orcas also rip off skin in other areas, they'll do the tongue and the mandible, and then they can peel off the skin from other parts of the animal. We think that one was probably an orca predation as well. And then we have some other intraspecific predation that is not obvious at all. Over several years, we've had, this is one of our harbor porpoises that suffered what we call porpoicide. And that is when bottlenose dolphins, typically juvenile, teenage bottlenose dolphins, gang up and they actually attack harbor porpoises. And they've been witnessed throwing them up in the air and ramming them with the two bottlenose dolphins will get on each side and ram the harbor porpoise, grabbing it by the lower jaw and holding it underwater. But the carcass looks beautiful from the outside. As you can see, it looks like a beautiful harbor porpoise. But when you open it up, there are broken ribs and broken vertebrae and hemorrhaging, massive hemorrhaging everywhere, fluid in the lungs. So dolphins are not very nice animals. But the reason why they're killing harbor porpoises is because typically they practice infanticide in their own species. So a young bottlenose dolphin is about the same size as an adult harbor porpoise. And so here is a neonate bottlenose dolphin with all sorts of rake marks over its body. That was probably an infanticide case. And then sometimes you learn different stories. Not all stories are obvious from their pictures. So you can see here, this is an adult female bottlenose dolphin. She was 900 centimeters. So, big enough that we could not get her out of this rocky area to do a necropsy. So we were only really able to look at the outside. And at first we saw all these marks all over the body and thought, oh, this must be, maybe it's an orca kill, but they're not wide enough. If you take an orca skull and you put the teeth on these rake marks, they don't fit, but they do fit other bottlenose dolphins. So then we were thinking, oh, maybe other bottlenose dolphins attacked this one, but that's not common with adults. We didn't think it happened with adults. But with the bottlenose dolphins, as with the orcas, we do take identification photos of every carcass that we work on. We do it with the large whales too. Tail flukes, especially on humpback whales, are really important for identifying individuals. Dorsal fins on blue whales help with identification if they're in the catalog. Gray whales, the patterning can help with identification. So here we took a picture of the dorsal fin, and you can see the one on the left is the carcass dorsal fin. And then we sent it off to all the researchers who study live bottlenose dolphins, and they were able to match the dorsal fin nicks with this animal. She was an adult female. She was named 𝗙𝗂𝗄𝗿 in the research program, and she had first been identified in 1991 in San Diego. And in 1991, she was already an adult female. She was at least 5 years old. I forgot when she stranded in 2015. So 1991 to 2015, she's in her 20s, at least, maybe in her 30s. And she was part of a nursery group of bottlenose dolphins, that adult females that work together to raise the young. And what the researcher told us is that this nursery group, in communicating with each other, they're very mouthy. So they're always using their mouths and biting at each other and biting on each other's skin. And so all of those rake marks came from the other bottlenose dolphins that were in her family group, her nursery group. So in this case, it was not an aggressive thing. It was just a communication thing. So if we hadn't talked to the researchers, we might have thought something different. So you have to be careful about the decisions that you make. And then some of the work that we do also helps researchers who are studying live animals within San Francisco Bay. So when we get a carcass, here's another just example of photo ID, where we have all these great photos of this female bottlenose or a harbor porpoise. And then there are these images of her alive in San Francisco Bay a few years before she was found dead. So there's always more information to be learned from carcasses than just a species in a place. Lots of stories. This one was the first whale that I ever worked on. This is an adult male sperm whale. He has been aged. because his tooth was sectioned and then aged, and I believe it was 48 years old, but I can never remember the ages. It's in our database, so I should look it up and put it on my presentation. But this sperm whale had 400 pounds of fishing net in its stomach. And so we think that with that amount of fishing net, it was no longer able to process its food, and its digestive tract was impacted, and that was the cause of death. There was no other signs of cause of death in this carcass. And then this is obviously an entanglement injury. So this was a very fresh orca. He's the largest orca currently on display anywhere in North America. He was 25 feet long. And he came on shore with these buoys. This is crab gear wrapped around his fluke and also wrapped around one of his flippers. We did the necropsy with the Marine Mammal Center and a local university and a small local science center. This was in Northern California. And we found 5 pinnipeds, so a couple of harbor seals and some California sea lions in its stomach. So it had fed very recently. And then the only real cause of death could only be the entanglement. And one of the theories is that with these orca, they get so stressed out when they're entangled that they suffer cardiac arrest from the stress of the entanglement. Because the fisherman had checked his gear a few days earlier and it was still there. And so this was an acute case. Some entanglements are much longer chronic cases. So we all worked on the necropsy. We collected the entire skeleton, and then we articulated the skeleton as a public activity with two Canadians and an Alaskan. And this is the leader of the Small Science Center. It is a specimen from the Cal Academy collection, but it is currently housed in the Small Science Center in Northern California, so that the community up there can learn from and experience the orca skeleton. So at least he went to good use. Here's a chronic entanglement case. So this is a gray whale that was also in Northern California. You can see its tail flukes were completely amputated. Lots of cyamids here. They tend to cluster around any kind of injury area. We could not do a necropsy on this animal. Prior to even going out and doing a necropsy, we have to get permission from the local landowners. Because once we open the animal up on the beach, it's their beach. We are not responsible for taking the carcass away. And the National Marine Fisheries Service here in the US, their policy is whenever possible to leave the carcass in place so that it provides food to invertebrates, to vertebrates. We had a coyote feeding off of the most recent carcass that we worked on. Turkey vultures, all sorts of animals will feed on these carcasses. And so the idea is you have to get permission before you open it up on the beach, because people may not be happy to have a blubber floating everywhere and parts all over the beach. And in this case, it was on a private beach and the landowner did not want us to open it up. On the negative side, if you don't open up a carcass, they tend to stay around for a much longer period of time. When they're opened up and they fall apart into pieces, especially if there's some wave action, typically the carcass pieces will all wash out within several weeks, usually. Sometimes a shorter period of time, sometimes a longer period of time. But there's still a carcass on a local beach that was high enough up on the beach. We didn't have a big enough team to do the necropsy. We found the cause of death by just opening up one side of the this carcass. We only had 4 people that day. We opened it up, we found hemorrhaging, and we found broken bones. And that was all we needed to know. And so we didn't open it up the rest of the way because we didn't have a big enough team. And it is still there. And that was from May. And now it's September and the carcass is still on the beach. So sometimes it pays to open it up. And some places will actually say, don't do it. And then they'll call us in and say, could you please open it up so that it decays faster and leaves. But in this case, he wouldn't let us do that. But this whale, the whale I just showed you, the one on the beach, when we sent photos of the fluke to the whale entanglement group here in California, we received reports that in March, so the whale was in Fort Bragg in April, and a month earlier in March, it was alive, swimming in Southern California, and was recorded by a whale watching ship. And this is it diving, but it would dive and then it would turn its body so that the peduncle that was remaining could act as a fluke and was swimming that way. But obviously it was not able to swim all the way to Alaska. It only made it to Northern California and then was found dead on the coast. But we were able to match the pictures of the amputated fluke with the pictures of the live whale from a month earlier, which was very cool. Sometimes cause of death is very obvious. Here are some propeller injuries. I'm sure you're familiar with those. Amputated flukes, consistent propeller marks, usually a measurable distance apart, very concentric. And then we actually had one large whale that showed evidence of an amputation by a large ship. And so you can see she ended up on a small island and she was missing most of her peduncle. This is just past the anus area and the genital slit here. You can see it better here. And the rest of her is completely chopped off. And that's a very clean cut. And so something really big amputated this animal. So we called that trauma and presumed injury from a ship. Sometimes they're just way too decomposed and disgusting for you to even see anything. We could not determine the cause of death in this animal. There was really nothing to see, and we didn't, there wouldn't be much inside to see on an animal this decomposed. Really, the internal organs liquefy much faster and decompose much faster than the outside of the carcass. So in this case, it would all be liquid inside. And then sometimes the animals are very fresh, like this animal, which was the other live stranded large cetacean that we had here, juvenile 1,300 centimeter fin whale. We could not find any cause of death. And, you know, maybe it was on the side of the carcass that we couldn't see, but because we couldn't turn it over, we could only examine the side that was available to us. So sometimes, even on the freshest animals, you don't have an answer. Sometimes they're too far away and you can't get to them, but you can use technology to at least get a species ID. So this is a humpback. We could get an estimate of the size by taking this turkey vulture is about 18 inches, and then you measure the turkey vulture, and then you measure how many turkey vultures make up the length of this body, and you can determine the size of the carcass and the species. And maybe there are orca rake marks on that flipper, but I'd have to have a much better picture of the flipper. But you can see this was drone footage. So the drone flew in and got some nice video that then we could look at and at least identify the size and the species. And if the penis was coming out, we would be able to tell it was a male. In this case, we couldn't really tell if it was male or female. And then here in California, I'm just going to touch on briefly, since 2019, we've had a high number of gray whale deaths, actually along the entire West Coast from Mexico all the way to Alaska. And so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the US declared it an unusual mortality event. So we're part of the investigative team that's been working to try and figure out why gray whales are dying in high numbers along the coast. And it's stranding response people all the way from Mexico to Alaska, academic people. We have people studying live gray whales and live orca up in Alaska. We have state and federal agencies, but we're all working together to try and determine what the cause of death is. And so we've tried to do as many necropsies as we can on as many carcasses as we can. And so here's some of the numbers. I didn't update them, but they're a little bit higher now for 2021, but not much. So in 2019, there were 214 total dead along the coast, 174 in 2020. Oh, right. And this was May. So I think it's something like 102 or 104 in the US now, because now the whales are in Alaska. So the number is a little bit higher. I'm sorry, I didn't update that. You can go to the fisheries.noaa.gov website for the gray whale UME and see the most recent numbers. But the numbers are going down, but there's still large numbers of them dying along the coast. And this just shows orange is 2019, green is 2020, and blue is 2021. And then black is the 18-year average from 2001 to 2018. And you can see just how many more gray whales have been dying than the average, the 18-year average. And you can see it also happens mostly in March, April, May, June, and July. And that's as gray whales travel from Baja California, Mexico, where the lagoons where they're breeding and starting to raise their young, all the way up to Alaska. And it's on their northern migration when they have not fed since the summer before that they are being found dead. One thing that is somewhat reassuring is that there was a similar unusual mortality event in 1999 and 2000. Those are in the blue bars. So it was more whales during that period of those 2 years. They had about 600 carcasses during those 2 years. And they were only able to necropsy 2 animals back then. They did not have the teams that we have now. And they didn't determine cause of death back then. But if we look at gray whale population size, prior to 1999, gray whales had been making a recovery after whaling stopped. And their population had rebounded to very high numbers, about 26,000. And then with that 1999-2000 unusual mortality event, they lost about 23% of the population. And we're seeing a similar thing now in 2019, since 2019. The gray whale numbers up to 2016, 2017 had gotten up to 27,000 gray whales again. And now we've lost in these 3 years about 24%. So this suggests that these large scale fluctuations are maybe not rare. Like the observed declines in abundance appear to represent short-term events that have not resulted in any detectable long-term impacts on the populations, because the population is able to rebound in between. And we're not finding any specific one cause of death. So these are some of the animals that we had in 2019. We had 14 dead gray whales just in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that was between February, March, April, and May. That's a lot of dead whales in a very short period of time. And we were able to necropsy a good portion of them. I don't remember exactly how many. We had 7 that showed signs of malnutrition. So one of the main hypotheses is that they're not getting enough food when they're feeding in the summer, and that their gas tank is empty when they're trying to make their way north. And so they're showing signs of emaciation. And so one thing we do when we have dead gray whales, if you look at this picture in the middle, the one that says human interaction trauma, 𝗂𝗂𝗿𝗙𝗲𝗏, this is a gray whale where you can actually see that it's emaciated. We call that a peanut head. The head almost gets like a neck where it's indented from loss of muscle and blubber. And then you can also see a large cyaamide load. So when they're very skinny, they do get lots of parasites, external parasites. So we're looking for malnutrition. We had 7 that showed malnutrition, 4 that showed signs of human interaction. So we're hit by ships, probably. 1 that showed trauma and malnutrition, and then 2 that were an unknown cause of death. Right, here's that one that was amputated too in 2019. In 2020, with COVID, we were not able to do as many necropsies, which it was a good thing. We only had 6 in San Francisco Bay Area in 2020. And of those 6, 1 showed signs of trauma, but it was orca related. 1 was a premature birth. It was a tiny little calf. This is it right here in the middle, the one that says premature birth, December 2019. So it was born as its mom was going south. 1 was possible malnutrition and 3 were unknown. So preliminary findings in several of the whales have shown evidence of emaciation, but these findings are not consistent across all of the whales. So more research is needed. And we have not ruled out disease or infection. Of course, we're all thinking about infections now. So the National Institute of Health here in the US is running some analysis on some of the samples from this unusual mortality event to look for any signs of infection or virus that could show up. So here's 2021. At the end of the season, we had 15 dead gray whales. 4 of them, it might be actually 6 of them, were suspected ship strike. 1 was malnutrition, and 1 was still floating, and the rest were unknown. But you can see several different situations here. Let me show you malnutrition. So this is an excellent example up in the upper right-hand corner of a whale that is showing signs of emaciation. Here's the peanut head, and then you can see the epaxial muscle along the spine has atrophied, and you can actually see the spine, and you can see the scapula outline too under the skin. Okay, so we're still working on the unusual mortality event. That one, here's the one again, showing signs of emaciation. This animal was actually seen feeding in San Francisco Bay for over 41 days prior to when it was found dead. Now, whales are not typically seen in San Francisco Bay, although they have been coming in more frequently in the past few years. And so it was photographed 3 times in the bay during March and April of this year, and then found dead. Unfortunately, it was also on a private, inaccessible beach, and so we could not do a necropsy, but this is the longest period ever recorded for a gray whale in San Francisco Bay. Sometimes we get sperm whales that we also don't know why it died. This one was, we think it died of old age. There was no other sign of any injuries, nothing. And we did collect all of those teeth. As you can see, this is a very busy beach. Hundreds of people were coming out. We had docents there. We had park rangers there. Everyone, you could hear, people were like, oh, it's a sperm whale. I'm going to go get the teeth. So we made sure that we took the jaw off the beach. It was about 800 pounds. The two mandibles fused together. And it took us 17 people to carry it off the beach. And then we had to carry it to the roof of the academy, which is a whole other story. But now we have those samples. We have had several Baird's beaked whales that washed up. They're a very deep pelagic species. Beaked whales are always exciting when they wash up. This was one in 2003. Here was one in 2016. The skull is still buried here at the academy. This one did have an amputated fluke, but it was too decomposed to tell whether or not the tissue around the fluke was hemorrhaging or showed fresh amputation. So we did not get a cause of death on this, but we think it was somehow related to the amputated fluke. And then our first Baird's beaked whale washed up in 1925. It was called the Santa Cruz sea monster, because here's one of those whale shrouds, right? Just a layer of skin floating on the beach. So people thought it had a neck and they thought it was a Loch Ness monster. But scientists, experts from the California Academy of Sciences went down and said, no, 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 this is a Baird's beaked whale. And that was the first specimen in our collection of that species. This is my favorite one of all. This is an orca that washed up in November of 2011. It had worn down teeth to the gum line, so we thought it must be a very old animal. However, his dorsal fin was still very small, so he was only about 12 to 15 years old. And actually, he had been recorded alive. Here's another instance of taking photos and sending them in for identification. The live orca folks said he was 0319, so the 319th offshore ecotype orca to be identified in their catalog. And he had been seen many times from Alaska all the way down through Canada and all the way down to when he died in California in 2011. We did not find a specific cause of death when we were working on the carcass on the beach. It was noted that there was fluid in the lungs, bloody fluid, bloody foam in the lungs and in the trachea. But when we articulated this skeleton, we noticed that this one rib had two breaks in it, one healed break and then one new break. And the vertebrae above that broken rib were stained from blood. And so we don't know for sure, but our hypothesis is that because orca do beat up on each other, especially young ones, and this was a young one, that he got bumped by another orca or banged by another orca multiple times, obviously, because of the healed wound, but then one last time when the rib broke and punctured his lungs. So he is now hanging on our main exhibit floor and is one of the many displays that we try and put on the main floor to educate the public about marine mammals. This is our Giants of Land and Sea display, which is currently on the main floor. We have a wall of sea lion skulls hanging up on the floor that people can see. And of course, several whole skeletons of cetaceans like that blue whale and the orca that I showed you. So some of this information hopefully can go to informing management and conservation changes. Prior to 2013, when ships left San Francisco Bay, they followed this purple route. They would, or when they came in, either way, they would go out to the end of the purple line and then they could just go off in any direction that they wanted at that point. And based on data that we collected and other organizations collected from ship strike whales, the shipping lanes were extended to these green lines. So that means that the ships have to stay in line for a much longer period of time until they're clear of the typical area where whales are, which is this purple circle. Ships are also encouraged to slow down as they come in and go out of San Francisco Bay and LA County in the LA port, the Port of Los Angeles. It is a voluntary slowdown, and some of the ships do it. And there's actually a program to give them awards when a certain percentage of the ships actually slow down on their way in and out of the bay. But it's not a requirement, and really a lower speed limit all across the board required would probably help out a lot more. So we're still gathering data to see if the changes in shipping lane has made a difference. And then there are things that folks that are out on boats here, we have an app called the Whale Alert app. You can put in reports of whales when you see them. This is a lot of whales seen around the Farallon Islands, where lots of whale watching trips go and where there's biologists working all year. But each one of these circles is a number of reports of whales in those areas. So you can see we're very busy here in the port, but citizens can add that data to the knowledge that we have of whales in the area. Of course, I have lots of people and lots of funding sources to thank for all of the work that we do and for the pictures and things in this presentation. And then with that, this is on Angel Island. Obviously, before we started the necropsy, this is another fin whale that also ended up showing signs of trauma with lots of broken bones and lots of hemorrhaging. But there's a nice view of the Bay Bridge while we're at the necropsy, before we get all stinky. So I can answer questions now.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, that's amazing.
Let me stop sharing.
Okay, all right. I have collected some questions. Ophal, could you let me know if there are people on YouTube who are asking questions? But I have I think about 2 pages of questions now.
Oof.
Okay, right. Well, there are some questions about how do we decide on when to do necropsies or not. Maybe the question would be related to codes, and also there are questions on that same note. I'll just show myself. What is the maximum window of time for the necropsy? How long after death can we still actually do necropsy? We'll do that one first, so then it's not too much.
Well, it's hard to really know, because most of the time we don't know how long an animal has been dead for. I mean, we thought 40 hours was really good and we were going to have nice fresh tissues, but even then some of it was autolyzed. So we try to open up every animal that we can, even if it's moderate decomposition, like the one that was dripping, that one we're not going to open up. But if it's mostly intact, we will open it up, because even if the tissues are all decomposed and macerated, if there are broken bones, you can still find the broken bones. And the blubber often will stay intact. So if there's bruising in the blubber, you can see that. So we will try and do one whenever we possibly can. If we have permission from the landowners and we can get a team together and it's safe enough and the tides are at a good time, we will try and do a necropsy, even if it's moderately decomposed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sometimes that's all you have.
Yeah, thank you. Oh my God, we have Dr. Nan, Dr. Ning. Hi, Dr. Ning. She's, she's all from Thailand. She's there. Thanks so much for coming. Okay, so, right, so with that one. So I suppose if you actually have only 48 hours window for California, the window for Indonesia is even going to be shorter, because we're tropical countries.
Right, but 48 hours is just, like, I wouldn't say 48 hours. Sometimes they're floating for days before they come on shore and we still open it up.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So, I mean, if it's floating in the water, then there's some cooling from, well, the ocean here is very cold. So there's some cooling, but I would say you're going to have to learn from experience and just try it. But even if it, like I said, even if it's completely mush inside, and sometimes they're just puddles, you can still find broken bones. And broken bones don't happen from, like some people will say, oh, that's from rolling around in the surf. And that does not happen.
Yeah, you need more.
You need much more impact to actually break bones. So
okay, all right. So yeah, okay. So I think Indonesia needs to learn to also study the bones, then, not just Okay, that's actually a very good take-home message. All right. So another question is, how do we minimize impact of necropsy to the environmental necropsy actually gives environmental contaminants and also zoonosis. Because of the robbers, etc. How do we minimize them? How do you guys minimize the zoonosis and also all those nitty-gritty things that the what do you call that? The necropsy has done. That's the first one. What else should also we do when we're doing sampling? What should we pay attention to? What should we pay attention to so that we can help that in finding the cause of death and also circumstances of death?
Right. So whether you do a necropsy or not, the carcass is going to be there on the beach. Yeah. And so if it's a very busy beach or it's a beach with endangered birds nesting on it, we are a little more careful about pieces that we cut off and just leave everywhere. But as far as zoonosis goes, there have not been, as far as I know, confirmed cases of transmission from a dead whale to humans. I know dogs, sometimes on dog beaches, people keep their pets away, which they should, because you never know what the carcass might have that could affect your pet. But as far as humans, I mean, we wear protective equipment, but that's mostly because of the smell. It's not really because we're afraid of getting disease. This last live whale that then died, we did find some clear fluid in the pleural cavity that we sampled. When we see a clear flowing fluid, one of the first thoughts is brucella or brucellosis. So in that case, that is a zoonotic. And so we were particularly careful after we found that fluid to make sure that nothing aerosolized and got into our faces or our eyes or anything. If it does come back positive for brucella, then anyone who is on the necropsy might have to have some blood work done just to make sure that they are not showing signs of it. But typically, we don't worry about zoonosis as much as, say, you would with a California sea lion or a pinniped of some kind. And the carcasses on the beach are not really, zoonosis is a nice way to try.
Guys, hello. Bapak, mohon maaf, tolong ya. Mohon maaf, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So if you use zoonosis as a way of keeping the public away, it works really well. But like just to tell them, like, oh, you have to keep your pets away. People get scared. But as far as an actual, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, and they know of a case where someone actually contracted something, we don't worry about it for ourselves as much.
Okay. The other
samples, and the other question was samples. So the Marine Mammal Center does most of the sampling. You guys should have Dr. Porigdunian come and talk to you too, because he's the pathologist there. So he is amazing at sampling. But they will sample every single tissue that they find and then prepare histological slides and then look at the tissues. So they'll collect lung, liver, kidney if they can,
Okay.
heart, everything. They collect everything. And then
Okay.
brain, you really want to get brain tissue if you can. It's
Okay.
really hard. You really have to go in through the foramen magnum. You have to like stick your arm in there if you can get in there to collect brain. And the fresher the brain, the better. But brain is where we're thinking, especially with the gray whales, we might be able to find some signs, some more specific signs of disease or infection. But so far, we haven't been able to find anything or to get brain.
How do you, if we can actually get brain, how do we preserve it?
You know, I'd have to ask the Marine Mammal Center. They do preserve most things in formalin.
Okay.
Or just frozen. And then I know they cultured that fluid recently, and then they're sending it off for PCR analysis.
Okay.
So I'm not on that end of things, so I'm sorry, I don't know how they preserve it. We preserve things in ethanol in the museum collection, so you you might be able to use ethanol.
Okay. For the sampling, so this is Mr. Simon Nani. So he was actually talking about, so if we actually consider that the cause of death or circumstances of death rather is boat strike, which parts should we actually collect or sample? If it is actually entanglement, we suspected entanglement, which part should we actually sample? So that was actually his question.
Okay.
But I thought that maybe it's actually much better to have everything, just sample everything and instead of jumping to conclusion, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why we do try and sample everything. So even if it's a traumatic injury, you have those samples in storage, whether it tells you anything right now, it might be used later. Like the blubber samples that we collected on every animal 20 years ago are now being used to look at lipid levels for this unusual mortality event. So
yeah,
we don't have opportunities to get close to these animals usually. So when you do, take everything that you can, take advantage of the opportunity in front of you and collect everything for archiving, because you never know what people are going to ask in the future and what they might be able to look at.
Also, I might actually need to summarize that in Indonesian. Jaya, tolong bantu ya tadi ya pertanyaan sampai sekarang. I just need to summarize that in Indonesian.
Sure.
Jadi untuk yang berapa lama setelah kematian, kalau di California itu 48 jam. Cuman di Indonesia kan tropis ya, jadi bisa jauh lebih cepat. Tapi yang penting adalah selama misalnya itu hewannya masih utuh dalam artian masih bisa nggak benar-benar meleleh gitu ya, itu masih bisa di necropsy. Even walaupun sudah misalnya parah banget bentuknya, kalau kita bisa belajar lebih banyak tentang anatomi dan tulang, kita masih bisa melihat kalau ada kemungkinan cedera di tulang itu. Jadi kalau ada hewan, kalau kita masih bisa ambil sampel dan masih bisa necropsy, mari kita necropsy saja. Dan sepertinya Indonesia juga harus mengarah kepada analisis untuk tulangnya itu juga kita harus perkuat. Kemudian kalau untuk yang sampling dari pertanyaan Pak Simon, walaupun jadi bukan dari, kita tidak bisa mengambil kesimpulan langsung Pak, jadi memang diambil aja semua sampelnya, kemudian jadi tidak dari kayaknya dia ship strike gitu, baru kemudian kita ambil sesuatu, karena bisa jadi kesimpulan atau hipotesis ship strike itu agak mungkin akan melenceng begitu. But Simon's point is actually correct as well, because he was saying this animal is so big and we don't have enough resources in Indonesia. So I guess that's the reason why he asked that. If there is a heavy suspicion of ship strike, then which one should we actually prioritize first, which you've already shown. But the reason why he was asking is because we don't have enough manpower or human power in Indonesia for the necropsy.
Well, the tissue vials that we archive for genetic samples are, tiny little pieces of muscle. So if you can't do anything else, I would sample tissues and skin samples for genetics and keep those. They can be in ethanol or they can be frozen. Okay. And that's fine.
All right. So Okay, there's another question from Risma Yunus. If the animal is actually floating, how do we actually do the necropsy on floating animals?
There are some crazy people who will try, but we do not. It's not safe. They do them on endangered species. Sometimes they'll go out with a boat and climb onto the whale. We don't do that. We either wait for it to come on shore, have it towed on shore, or if it floats out and we never get to do the necropsy, then we do as much as we can from photos.
Oke, ya. Jadi untuk Mbak Risma, untuk Dokter Risma, jadi kalau misalnya masih bisa ditarik ke darat, tarik aja ke darat, karena kalau terapung itu berbahaya untuk orangnya juga, karena kan pakai senjata tajam, benda-benda tajam gitu. So, oke, ya. Kalau untuk alat berat dan sebagainya, pertanyaannya sudah terjawab tadi dalam presentasi ya Mbak Risma. Nanti mungkin kita bisa lanjutkan di forum yang Indonesia saja. There is a question from Sandy Ling. Is it possible to differentiate between fresh and old rake marks? In general, are the whales involved in ship strikes well fed and in good health? Or do they show signs of disease or poor condition?
Right. So there are ways to tell old healed up rake marks from new fresh rake marks. And that just comes from seeing a lot of them. Big adults will actually have rake marks that have nothing to do with the cause of death. They got them throughout their life, and you can see that they're healed. You can also see that on histology. So if it's an orca predation, we do actually take samples of the injury for histology for the pathologist to look at. And then what was the other part of the question?
The whales involved in ship
Oh, right. If they're in good health. So typically we do try to assess the overall health. We have for a long time measured blubber depth in various locations, dorsal, lateral, and ventral. However, there is no one knows specifically what a good blubber depth is and what a bad, like what a poor condition blubber depth is. And so what you want to also look for, you want to measure the blubber depth just as data to collect, but then you want to look for subcutaneous fat, internal fat. So if there are good fat stores, then the animal is in good condition. And like those skinny whales that I showed you, like we're looking for obvious signs of malnutrition and atrophy. And so those do show poor condition. Now, once they start decomposing and they start bloating, you no longer can see what you might have been able to see when they were fresh. And so we actually deflate the whale first. We take pictures of it, then we poke some holes in it and let the air out. And then we take more pictures to see if then we can see the vertebrae under the skin or the scapula poking out or that peanut head. So, but typically you're looking at blubber depth and you're looking at subcutaneous fat. And if it has a lot of subcutaneous fat, it's in very good body condition.
Okay. Okay, another one is from Olivia Annabelle. So I'm just reading what she's writing. She wrote, from what I heard, some cases are caused by orcas. Is it a normal thing in the ocean? Like maybe it's a part of their food chain? If
Yes.
it's not, does every whale whom eaten by the orca will come out of the ocean with specific signs? And does humans have something that they can do to stop it if it is not a normal thing?
So it is a very normal thing. The orca that feed on whales are a specific ecotype of orca that feed on marine mammals. There's another group that feeds only on fish. And then my favorite orca feeds only on sharks. And so they have different feeding strategies. And the orcas that feed on marine mammals, they actually hang out in the areas where the moms and the calves are passing by. So in the spring, as the mom and the calf are going from Mexico to Alaska. Down in Monterey, which is south of San Francisco, the orcas tend to congregate there because there's a big canyon. And so the young poor calves are swimming across this open water with nowhere to hide. And that's where the orcas will try and separate the calf from the mother. They primarily only eat the young juveniles and calves, but they can attack whales, you know, that are 100 centimeters, 10 meters in size. But it is a very normal part of they're the top of the food chain as far as whales are concerned.
Ya, oke, thank you. Jadi untuk kalau orca predation normal ya. Is there any specific method and tools you use to do the necropsy in different species of whales? For instance, like with humpbacks, you would use different tools, or is that the same?
It's all kitchen knives and gaffing hooks, you know, nice pointy gaff hooks that you have to be careful to cut a hole through the blubber so the gaff hook comes in. So you have one person who's a hooker and one person who's a cutter, and they work together to peel that blubber back. So it's really muscles and knives.
Do you make your own hook then?
No, we buy those from like fishing supply places.
Alright, oke. Jadi kalau untuk membuka kulitnya paus itu ada yang jadi udah ada bisa pakai kayak tali pancing gitu, kayak kait ya, dikaitkan ke kulit kemudian
ganco, Mbak. Ganco kalau nelayan.
Ganco, ganco, yeah, ganco, okay. Alright, well, we'll coming to the last question now, and I'll give to maybe somebody else who wants to ask as well. From Antin, from your experience, how long does it take to do necropsy on one whale, as in assuming normal size of whale, and get all the organs sampled, including the brain sample? And maybe
so
also that how many people do you need?
Right. That it does depend on how many people you have. A typical response, like say for 10 meter carcass, we would have 8 to 10 people. So not huge. And we only have about a 3 or 4 hour window of time with the tide. So it has to be at a little bit before low tide and then a little bit after low tide, because you don't want the water moving the carcass. So really every necropsy that we do, it takes about 3 or 4 hours of time. So it takes a lot of time to get ready and to get your team together, and sometimes to drive there. And then we have a safety briefing. I forgot to mention that, but before we even go to the beach, we get in a group and we all introduce ourselves and we talk about safety. We wear, they're called Kevlar gloves. So on our non-cutting hand, so if you're right-handed, on your left hand, you wear a Kevlar glove, and then you wear a latex glove, and then you wear those really big gloves. And then that way, if you slip and get your hand, you have some protection. So we always have Kevlar gloves on one hand, and we talk about safety. We talk about COVID. We talk about working closely together. We talk about gaff hooks and knives, and don't ever stick the knives in the whale and walk away. Sometimes people just stick them in. Well, number one, it looks terrible. Someone's going to take a picture of that carcass with all these knives in it, and then they're going to post it on social media, and that's a nightmare. But also, if a wave comes up or something, you don't want your knives to go out into the ocean. You don't want anyone to fall on it. It's just dangerous. And then always, if you're working in the whale with a knife, always hand the whale or the knife to somebody outside the whale so you can step out safely. So you're not climbing on the whale with your
definitely you need ladder then. You also need the ladder.
I know. I have a nice picture of someone up on some buckets. But,
all right.
Yeah, we have had to bring ladders out. The ladders help a lot. So,
I have another question. here. Well, actually, my own question: what is the importance of a pelvic bone during to understand pelvic bone? Because you were mentioning it in the first one.
Right. So originally, people thought pelvic bones were just a remainder from when whales used to walk on land. They're innominates, you know, but there was recently a publication that looked at pelvic size and shape of pelvic bones, and they were able to determine that they actually play a role in sexual selection. So having those pelvic bones in the museum for research, actually they answered a question. Now, we always want to have one, because we're a museum, it's almost like we didn't even go to the whale if we don't have a piece in the collection. We need some kind of piece that is going to last forever. And so the pelvic bone is the easiest piece. You can't, there's not always baleen. Sometimes the baleen falls out very early, but at least the pelvic bone is one easy piece we can get and we can take home. Sometimes we get ribs, sometimes we take broken bones to show the broken bones. But the pelvic bone, if you get it from every single one, then you can compare. And some of them actually have the femurs, little residual femur bones attached to them. It's very cool.
Is that actually you can determine the sex of the animal from pelvic bone, did you say? Or?
You can't exactly determine the sex of the animal, but they did find that because the pelvic bone is attached to the penis, the size of the pelvic bone had some effect on sexual selection. But they're in different places. In the male, they're kind of, so you go to the genital slit and you just move dorsally. For the female, it's just right there between the blubber layer and the muscle, right in the initial muscle layer after the blubber layer. But the males is a little bit further back. So we can send drawings if you want to start looking for pelvic bones.
I think
Kate is really good. Kate's really good at finding them.
I think we're just going to do with the bones first, just all the bones. All right. Others, maybe Danny or maybe Daniel Crab is here. Jaya, definitely. Maybe you have any questions. Is that okay for another 5 minutes, Mo?
Sure. And I'm going to put those links in the chat.
Oh yes.
Let
me do that. Let me do that for you. Yeah.
You want to do that? Because I have them right here too.
Yeah.
There was actually a video made of that necropsy where the vertebrae were dislocated at 90 degrees. Yeah. I think you see me for like 2 seconds, but mostly it's the PBS lady. She was the star, but it's those are really good videos to watch. Okay. The one that is the island whale autopsies. That one is just a 2-minute one, the top one of the actual necropsy on the beach.
Okay. It says it's not available, but maybe it's only because I'm living in Australia. I don't know.
You can't watch YouTube?
Maybe we can.
PBS?
Yeah, okay. I'll just give it for other questions. Jaya or Denny or others, do you have any questions? Dr. Ning, do you have any question if you'd like? Anyone?
I have a question, just a little bit. If you find a live stranded whale, do you attempt to help rescue them first, and how do you do that? Because they're so big, and you cannot calculate the drug dosage and anything like that. Or does it happen that you have saved whales by like the veterinarians and things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, so the veterinarians go out prepared to euthanize the whale, because if the animal is on the beach, then there is something seriously wrong in our area. I know there are some places like on the East Coast in the US where live dolphins will strand live, but it's because they got lost and they ended up inside the bay and they really wanted to be on the other side. And so in those situations, the rescue organizations will make efforts to move the dolphins back to where they're supposed to be. But typically on our coast, and we don't have a lot of experience with it because thank God it doesn't happen very often, that there is something wrong with that whale that has put it up on the beach. And there's no way you can get it to go back in the water. Even this one that was alive earlier this month, it got itself back into the water during the higher tide, and then it died. It never took another breath. They watched it for an hour and it didn't take another breath. So they come prepared with a euthanasia kit that's designed for large cetaceans, but is based on elephant euthanasia techniques. And sometimes like you have to be really careful if you have to dart the animal. There have been situations where the dart bounced off of the whale, and then you have this loose dart that you can't find on the beach. And so they had to shut the beach down for weeks trying to find the dart. So now I believe that they have darts that have GPS trackers in them. So if it doesn't go into the whale, you can actually find it, and no kid is going to step on it and get injured. So yeah, it's not a good situation. Same thing with when it's like an individual small cetacean that has stranded here on our coast, they will bring them to the rehab center, but often they're not able to. There's a reason that it's there. It's injured in some way. I know things are probably really different in New Zealand and Australia, and maybe even over where you are, that there might be other reasons they're stranding. And thank God we don't have mass strandings. I just could not deal with that.
Actually, Dr. Ning, do you have any more questions?
No, thank you very much. But I agree that it would be almost impossible, because the dosage of the drugs and things like that. But to use elephant's method of euthanasia is very dangerous for people around that too, for the necropsy.
Yes.
And also, do you have sorry, just a little bit more. So if you use like M99 or something like that used for elephants, it's quite dangerous for the people who would go inside there and, like touch the blood and things like that also. Do they have precaution for this too?
I don't think they've ever been completely successful. I think what ends up happening is within an hour or two, at least in our experience, which for me, is 2 live whales on the beach here. They have just died within an hour or two of being on the beach. And the one in New York that I know about where they lost the dart, I think they ended up using firepower. Firearms. Yeah. So
Australia does that too with the firearm into the blowhole.
Yeah, there's nothing easy about it.
Thank you.
Could I add something on that, Icha?
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, maybe also following up on Nartika's question, because that was also some of my questions as well, how to deal with the live whales. That here actually I'm working with small dolphins, air dolphins, but we have these cases, and we keep wondering what to do if we have a large whale beached, or we have even we had a group of sperm whale beached in Aceh at one stage. And so in your case, is it always like if the big whale strand, there must be something, they must be sick, or they must be not unable to be once released, for example, at some miraculous way, they can stay alive? Or is it always better to do euthanasia? Or because at that time they have been pulled, I think, into the sea, and I'm not sure if afterwards they were restranded. Do you remember, Icha? I don't think they were. Of those released, we had any reports of them being restranded, at least not on the Indonesian coast.
There has been some single sperm whale strandings afterwards, but not in Aceh, so we cannot say.
No, we cannot say.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that we give the right recommendations here as well. Like, is it worth? When do we decide to try to rescue a large whale, and when would we say no, we can't rescue this whale? And how in Indonesia could we do this kind of euthanasia or something.
Right. There are, because that is not my experience. I only have experience with 2 live whale strandings. I would suggest contacting some of the folks in the southeastern US or the International Fund for Animal Welfare, IFA, in Massachusetts. They're the ones that deal a lot with bottlenose dolphins that get stuck in the around the Cape in Massachusetts in the wrong place. And then they have special vans that they put the dolphins in and then drive them to the ocean, open ocean, and then release them. Because mass stranding events are so different than individual live whales that we have encountered here on the West Coast. I am definitely not the best person to ask about that. But I know that there are organizations that bring them in for rehab. Several aquariums in the eastern US have big pools that they, bring in small dolphins and porpoises and have to swim them for 24 hours and things like that. But they would give you the best information. Yeah.
Okay, the question was actually particularly for the large whales, because the dolphins and the pilot whales, they do rescue them, or I think the last cases they were all dead, but one probably in Probolinggo. But it's just for the larger whale, the big whales, how to deal with them. How do we decide which one is rescuable and which one is not?
Well, and from what we saw with the whale that was alive on the beach for a very short period of time, there was evidence of muscle maceration close to the spine that we attributed to capture myopathy. And so even though it was only on the beach for a very short period of time, that period of time on the beach actually caused additional damage to whatever caused her to get on the beach in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so the stress of being in that situation also contributed to death. So I'm not sure how you would make that decision. And I don't, you can't get heavy machinery out to push a large whale back into the water because you could damage it when you're pushing it. So
well, something that I do think would be beneficial to look at first, Danielle, especially in your area, is to look at tides, because I know that this type of situation does happen up north with killer whales, where the killer whales will just be near shore fishing for salmon, and then all of a sudden tide goes out and they get stranded in the rocks. And so they do have those types of instances where the animal is healthy and they just have to wait for the tide to come back in. And so those types of situations do happen on the West Coast. It's just because the California coastline is so different, we don't typically get these types of cases. We are typically seeing unhealthy animals. Mm-hmm. And so I think, especially talking to Isha and your guys' area, I think tides do have a big impact on your strandings. And so I think also looking at your areas, and especially maybe past cases where you've been kind of questioning large whale strandings and those types of things, maybe take a look and see what type of tide it was at that time, and just also kind of take that as a first step in the future too, if you get those types of cases, to see, was it an outgoing tide all of a sudden, because it could possibly have just been an animal that was close to shore on an outgoing tide, and then take it from there on as like a next step.
Okay, noted. We have to wrap up soon because it's quite late at Mo's place and Kate's place. But there are two stranding related to mass stranding. I think because Dr. Ning, if you would make it like also an impromptu discussion forum with Mo as well. The question is, so for mass strandings, do you guys have any tips which animals should be necropsied? For mass stranding dead animals, which one do we actually necropsy first, or should necropsy for the sampling? So that one for the mass stranding. Another one, and then we have to close it down.
Well, if I ever had a mass stranding, I think I would go for the freshest ones first, what looks freshest from the outside, so that you may get higher quality tissue samples from that, from those animals. So if you can determine which ones are fresher, I guess, I don't know how you would determine that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ning, what do you think?
I think first of all, for mass stranding, if they're not all dead, first you have to separate the live ones and help them first for choosing the carcass. And I agree with Mo that you know, you want to get the best result, so you get the freshest one first. But if you have many people, usually we have to divide the carcasses into like groups. You know, the condition 1, 2, 3. And then you try to preserve them as soon as possible. And necropsy, the freshest one first. I agree with that. But first, help the live ones.
Yeah,
I agree.
And I assume in a mass stranding situation, you would not be looking for signs of trauma, because that's probably not associated with it. So your main goal is to get samples, good quality samples.
Okay, the last question is about a dead whale. A year ago, there was a dead whale in Kupang, which is in eastern Indonesia. It's about 29 meters, or let's say times 3, it's almost 60, almost 55 feet, I think. The whale's stomach was bloated quite big, and we were afraid, or they were afraid, it might explode any time. Should they pierce it through by spare or bullet gun first, or should they actually have cut it slowly by scalpel to get inside the stomach because it's bloating? He thinks that the problem from the first one is you may actually make unwanted damage with the spare or with the bullet, but for the other one, if you're just using scalpel, it might actually endanger the scalpel exploration. The scalpel operator in case it actually explodes in the face.
So when if an animal is bloated, usually when you make the first cuts in the body, the gases will come out, and you just have to be ready to move really quickly. So that I mean, they sometimes the intestines can come out quickly, but you just have to be ready for that. But we never use scalpels on large whales. We always use kitchen knives. Like, I like a knife that's this big. Some people like knives that are much bigger. Machetes. Some people use machetes. I use just a kitchen knife. But you can cut anything carefully with a kitchen knife and let the gases come out, and maybe step back so you don't breathe them all in, because that's not pleasant. But
Dr. Ning, do you have any tips for debloating big whales?
Yes, I'm expert in that. So no, just kidding. I do the same. With the strength of the bubbler and everything, it's not going to explode like, you know, like you think it's going to pump like a balloon. So if you make a small cut, like maybe you know, like 20 like some 10 inches or something like that, I mean 10 centimeters, a very small cut, it's gonna hold. But make sure you cut a little bit like on top, so the fluid usually it's down there, so you try to release just the gas out. If you cut it down, all the fluid and everything will come out. So that's my trick, is usually I try to get the upper part of the, you know, the whatever ventral part there is, and then you stab, kind of like stab it, but slowly. You know, gentleness surrenders mountain. So just gently and let the gas flow out, and then you can start cutting. I have never been exploded into the face, but yeah. And don't step backward. Don't step backward. It's gonna get to your face. Step on the side, you know. Like when somebody tries to hit you, you know, you're like on the side, and then you know you will not get it directly on the face.
Okay, that's a good one. Thank you so much. Jadi Pak, Jadi pakai parang atau pisau dapur bukanya, jangan pakai scalpel karena scalpelnya bisa patah juga kali, nggak akan bisa itu. Jadi jangan pakai peluru tapi pakai parang atau pisau dapur. Kemudian dipotongnya itu, ditusuknya itu dari ke perut tapi yang bagian atasnya gitu, sehingga tidak benar-benar langsung kemana-mana itu cairannya. Dan kalau mundur itu jangan mundur kemudian langsung menyingkir, tapi menyingkirnya jangan mundur, menyingkirnya ke samping gitu, supaya kalau ada ledakan jangan ke mukanya gitu. I think that covers it. Daniel, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something about the knives, because I think the knives are not only useful for large whales, but actually also for the dolphins. Like we found out that it's
like
much faster, the kitchen knives, I mean, and we have 3 types of larger and smaller kitchen knives, and very sharp and so on, and that works perfectly, much better if you're not getting into the details of the things. But and then actually we don't use the scalpels.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. Okay, all right. I am so happy with all this conversation today. Hari ini sangat seru sekali ya teman-teman. We have to end it unfortunately, but this really opens up the gate that we really need more talking like this at the Southeast Asian level, yeah, Dr. Ning as well, yeah. So we definitely need to get, well, we know already that we can actually meet up. We'll just have, you know, Southeast Asian people meeting up. We can invite the cast again, Mo and Kate from the cast and other people. It's actually, there's a lot of people who wants to come as well. Sometimes it's not in the right time zone, etc., because people from India might also want to come as well. So as a moderator, I would like to thank you very, very much for Mo, Kate, and Dr. Ning. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom. You're, as you said, you're the expert on those things. It's amazing. We will have to catch up again one day. Thank you very much, and I'll catch up with Mo and Dr. Ning and Kate later at some other time, and I'll give it back to Laila. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies.
All right, thank you, Mbak Ica. Okay, wow, that was an amazing presentation. Yeah, thank you for me, thank you for Mbak Ica and all. So before we close the webinar, karena webinarnya sudah mau selesai, I would like to I want you to turn on your camera for the photo session, for the documentation. Jadi okay, Bapak Ibu sekalian, dipersilahkan untuk menyalakan kameranya. Jadi untuk dokumentasi. Yeah.
Mo, I think we need you now again so that I've already taken a lot of your photos actually, Mo, but this is documentation. Is Mo still
for the documentation? Maybe
Mo is not here anymore.
So I'm gonna from 1 to 3. Saya akan menghitung 1, 2, 3. Karena ada 3 layar, because there are 3 screens for the Zoom, so I'm gonna take like 3 pictures. Yeah. So saya akan hitung ya. 1, 2, 3. Okay, once more. All right. 1, 2, 3. All right. Once more. 1, 2, and 3. All right, thank you everyone. I hope that you can take the advantage of this webinar. Thank you Mbak Ica, thank you Dr. Ning, and Dr. Daniel. Thank you everyone.
Thank you Mo and Kat, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Miss you.
Jangan lupa buat teman-teman dokter hewan, kita lanjut ke link selanjutnya ya.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's the Asian people, the Asian folk. We need to get together again. Somebody needs to organize it.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Isha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ning.
And Daniel.
I'll see you around. See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you everyone. Jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian, bagi para dokter hewan, karena acaranya masih berlanjut ya untuk melanjutkan pelatihan yang kemarin, Bapak Ibu sekalian bisa join di link yang ada di undangan atau link yang sama dengan yang kemarin. Jadi bisa klik di link itu, kita akan lanjutkan acaranya.
Terima kasih Laila.
Sama-sama, Bu Ligi.